Hey guys, um, it looks like a guy by the name of Sopater the Berean, um, who I've interacted with in comments and have seen around for a while. He's made a handful of videos that I've seen. It looks like he's going to start making more videos, so I'll put the link to his testimony video in the box. And seems like he's got some good stuff to say, so check him out, and hopefully he makes many videos concerning different things. Um, Moving on to the point of this video, preterists, and the main point of this video is to talk about Paul a little bit more, but saw another preterist video yesterday, and basically the accusation is made that futurist type people keep making videos on preterism, basically because they're trying to convince themselves that they're right? So it's kind of like, if you don't believe in preterism, why do you make videos about it? Well, I guess Kel must be struggling with the Trinity mightily. You know, that's they say some of the strangest things, man. I don't know, you know, because you speak out against something because it rubs you wrong. And you got to remember, like you said, like I said, you got people that contact you about this stuff. You know, they sending you messages, you're getting phone calls from people, and so you make videos about it. And now apparently if you do that, you're just making videos about it because you're trying to convince yourself around the truth of preterism. And this is coming from a person who made anti-Trinitarian videos, so I guess this person must be struggling mightily with the Trinity himself, trying to convince himself that the Trinity isn't true. It's ridiculous. I really don't understand why they say some of the things that they say. But to talk a little bit about Paul now, and this stuff about the end of the world. And like I said in my previous video, I think Paul had an end times eschatology that was very close early on in his walk. And I think that changed. And when I say close, see, this is another thing the preterist fails to deal with the inner mechanics of scriptures, in my opinion. And in Paul's mind, it wasn't 70 AD. It was literally months or a year or two or three or four. I think he thought that it was going to happen really, really, really soon. I mean, ridiculously soon, retardedly soon, and not 30 years soon. It was definitely a lot closer than that, in his opinion, early on in his walk. I think that was the instinct that he had. Now, if we go, I want to talk about something here, and this is along the conceptual lines of things. If you look at 1 Corinthians 7:25, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if you are betrothed, if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as they have none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Okay, so you got to ask yourself, why is Paul saying something like this? And it's because he thinks it's soon. But you also, to me, it betrays the purpose. Now we're going to take a look at this word form. It's not the word morphe, okay? It's the word schema, all right? Or schema. It says fashion, habit, form, or appearance. Properly exterior shape, the outer shape, is used of Jesus's earthly body in Philippians 2:7 and 8. Christ incarnated into a genuine physical body, which was not an exact match with typical humanity because his body never touched or tainted by sin, even original sin they put in there. He's talking 2 Corinthians, and you go down, and it's from the word echo, from figure or shape, and it's translated twice as appearance and form, and it says from as Ecleus down to Latin habitus, fashion, but in Philippian habitus, tacitly opposed to the material or substance. 1 Corinthians 7:31, the habitus, as compromising everything in a person which strikes the senses, the figure bearing discourse, actions, manner of life. Philippians 2:7. See the cinnamon and at the end of Schmidt. So when you look at this word, ultimate form as a mode or circumstance, i.e. implication, the external condition. Okay? So what Paul is saying here, and when you compare it to Philippians, it says being found in appearance as a man, and it's that same word, being found as a man, form or appearance, being fashioned as a real man. So it's what the person is, what it is, what you behold of that person. Slightly different than morphe. So in Corinthians, what is he saying? For the present appearance of the world is passing away. He's expecting it to change. The actual form that the world takes is going to change, and that has to be something that can be observed. That is one of the keys to understanding this word, is that it can be observed, i.e. implication, external condition, or fashion. Now, this change that happened in 70 AD is not an external condition that one can observe. It was in secret, which to me plainly violates everything in Scripture. But now we have to look at it. This is where the thinking of a preterist just kind of falls apart. You take this warning here, don't get married, don't do this, don't buy. Say everyone took that advice. Say everyone froze in that condition of life. The first question you have to ask yourself is why? Why would Paul say that? What was he expecting? He was expecting the end, a literal end, not a invisible secret end. Because now what happens to these people? And he goes on to correct this teaching to a more patient style of waiting. But if we go with these warnings, these early warnings right here, 70 AD comes, right? Now what? Now what do? They're just standing there refusing to buy or sell or get jobs maybe and all this other stuff. There was a reason he said this. So what is Paul telling them? To run until 70 AD and then go ahead and get married. Now, you know what I mean? It's kind of ridiculous when you stop to think about it. These kind of warnings, you find them today. What's that dude that said the world was going to end on like July 29th or something? The old white crusty dude. The same thing. The reason people make these kind of warnings is because they perceive that that's going to be it. There's not going to be no getting married after the fact. There's not going to be any jobs after the fact. There's not going to be buying and selling or doing what we consider normal carnal activities today. They're going to completely cease because the form of the world, the fashion of the world, the external appearance of the world, aka its dying state, this carnal state, is going to be changed, and none of these things are going to be necessary. That is the only reason people give warnings like this. It's like, hey, this judgment is around the corner. Be pure, because none of this crap is going to matter once this judgment happens. So you have all these people now, if you stick in this mindset, and they were corrected by 2 Corinthians and other teachings by Paul. But that's the other thing. It's Paul, he wasn't waiting for 70. Yeah, I was just reading some stuff about James Tabor. He was waiting for something very close, way closer than 70 AD, way closer. I think anything past 5 years, 10 years at the most would have shocked him. And I think he grew into this understanding. that it's what he felt. It was in his bones. He just felt it. He felt that the end was around the corner because Jesus came and died. The mere fact Jesus had come had to mean it was going to happen again soon. But again, look at the nature of these kind of warnings. And then there's no teaching after this. There's no teaching telling people not to get married. And like I said, in Ephesians, he has a different take on this subject altogether. But that's why people give these kind of warnings. It's because they don't expect it to matter. Well, guess what? After 70 AD, you still had to feed yourself. People still had to get married and have children to continue the faith. The faith itself would have died out if everyone would have took this advice and froze. And all the men said, well, we're not getting married no more because the end is just around the corner. The faith would have died right then and there. I'll tell you that right now. So I just wanted to point that out. This kind of goofy thinking, there's a reason warnings like this are given. And it's not because there's some invisible perception. And the very nature for the present form of this world is passing away. It goes against any kind of internal perception. It's an external perception. You were going to go out into the world and you would see the world was different. There was no detectable change within the way of life and the way things worked in the world from 70 AD. None whatsoever. And, to say that, I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. That's the point of this video, is to take someone like Paul and put him into that kind of thinking. It creates a problem. And it makes the warning itself a problem. Paul grew in his understanding. The static model of Paul is just not sustainable. And these phrases, the present form of this world, like I said, it's the fashion of the world, the external appearance of the world is what it's related to. It was something you'd be able to perceive. No one could perceive what happened in the preterist model, 70 AD. It was completely spiritually discerned. It was something that had nothing to do with the external world. But those are the nature of those kind of warnings. Like I said, it's like you have to ask what happened to these people after 70 AD and how come this kind of teaching was not carried on. And like I said, when you get to the John Polycarp connection, the mere fact that Polycarp doesn't even use the Gospel of John and does not have this type of language, if there was one person who would have known, I would expect it would have been Polycarp. And I think Clement in his the Pseudo-Clementines, I think he has a lot of truth to say. As a student of Peter, I think he had a lot to say. And I think, they call them Pseudo-Clementines just because it causes problems for the church. But, that's a canon thing. That's a whole nother issue. But think about that. What happened to all these people that carried out this warning if they weren't corrected by later documents and teachings? They were just like those people you see today that think the end of the world's around the corner, and the reason they give all this stuff up is because they think that there's no point in owning a house. There's no point in owning any of this stuff anymore because the external form of the world is going to pass away. Paul thought the creation was going to be renewed, and none of this stuff was going to matter. But after 70 AD, it continued to matter. You still had to feed yourself. Okay, you still had to do things. Even Paul worked throughout his whole life. Why didn't Paul quit working altogether? He didn't. It was because of human practicality, and that practicality continued. So that's all I got to say on this one. Making videos against preterism has nothing to do with convincing me. It's just exploring the issue of it and, the goofiness of it all. And it has to do also with answering individual questions that I get asked. And to make such a point like that, basically, if you make videos against Islam in his statements, you're basically saying that you know Islam is true, but you have to convince yourself that it's not true. If you make videos against the Trinity, it's because you're struggling with the Trinity, and that's why you keep talking about it, is because you have to convince yourself. So these people are very two-sided, if you want to have my opinion on it. Teaching against something has nothing to do necessarily with convincing yourself that it's not true. These warnings that Paul gave, like I said, the external form of the world passing away, using the word schema, that's also found in Philippians 2:8. The actuality of something, and it involves an external appearance. That's the only way you could tell Jesus was a man, because you could behold he was fashioned as a man. Okay, Same thing with the world. The difference between the renewed world and the old world is because you could behold its fashion. You could behold it, understand it, that it worked a certain way, and this is what was going on. So that's it for this video. I think that's a very interesting thing to think about with Paul is the nature of these warnings and stuff, and what their warnings about. Why, it's because he expected it all to end. The system, the system that he lived in, that he could behold and he was part of, was going to completely and utterly cease to exist. That did not happen in 70 AD. And like I said, Paul changed his opinions on this as he got older. And this is another trait of all these doctrines, all these Trinitarians and preterists and oneness people. They make everything static. It's like everyone was one way throughout their entire life, yet the scripture plainly tells you that even Jesus grew in wisdom and knowledge. So what that tells you is that he held understandings that apparently he changed as he went. They had to learn something. What does that mean? That means when you learn, that means what you currently perceived about it was probably incorrect. So this inhumane, static model of all these people is very detrimental, and it stops you from taking in the whole picture. And that's what I see with a lot of these views, including preterism, is they don't make sense of all of the scripture. And they're, in their mind, dealing with Old Testament passages is simply saying that Jesus interpreted those for it. No, he didn't. He actually didn't. He really didn't. And it defeats the purpose of the Old Testament. And I find it to be a dishonest exegesis. The point of the Old Testament, I don't even like using the word Old Testament, but the point of the covenantal writings of the Jewish people include warnings against false prophets. And if you let people change what those scriptures mean, then you've lost your ability to defend yourself against false prophets altogether. And just arbitrarily planting your flag in the New Testament and saying, well, Jesus is true, so everything he says is true. That's not even a test I think Jesus would have condoned. Jesus would have said to check the scriptures against me, see that I'm telling you the truth, not that he's changing things, and a topic I'm going to get into later too. I started thinking about this, and I'll throw it out there just to get thoughts on it. But I noticed in Matthew, going back to that, it says that he says, I've come not to abolish the law or destroy it, but to fulfill. And I started thinking about that. People are taking that term fulfill and basically using it to say abolish. And I don't think that's, see what I'm saying? He says he came not to abolish the Torah, not to abolish. So we've established that he came not to abolish. So no matter what he says next, it can't contradict that term, to abolish the Torah. To fulfill means to fill up or to complete. So in other words, in my mind, he's saying that he came to carry out the Torah perfectly. That has nothing to do with throwing it out or anything else, because he says in the statement before it, I've come not to abolish it. So no matter what we want to think, because that to me, just like with Trinitarian arguments, it's kind of where I would expect to see it. I would expect Jesus to say, I've come to do away with the Torah. I've come to fulfill it and do away with it. I've come to abolish the Torah by keeping it perfect. You see what I'm saying? I would expect some kind of different verbiage to be used, but he says it outright. I've come not to abolish the Torah. So no matter what he does or what he says, he says it himself. He came not to abolish the Torah. So that's something I want to explore and think about. To complete the Torah or fulfill the Torah, or basically to do the Torah perfectly, has nothing to do with getting rid of it. He says it in his own words. I've come not to abolish. So how do you take the words of Jesus now? How do you say he's come not to abolish the Torah, and then you turn around and you abolish it? When his own words said, I haven't come to do that. I have not come to abolish the Torah. And that's why I'm getting back to that term when I tell people, not one jot nor tittle shall pass away until heaven. Well, Ecclesiastes 1:4 is very clear. The earth will always remain forever. So it's literally not going to pass away. That's what people need to think about. It's literally not going anywhere. According to Scripture, the earth will remain forever. That's a fact. Preterism cannot support that model. Genesis chapter 8 says, as long as the earth remains, there'll be weather cycles. So we see those things working in harmony. I think what Jesus is doing there is giving a warning. He's saying heaven and earth will pass away. See, you have to, that's exegeting scripture. You have to think about these things instead of just running with the term. Oh, every time I see heaven and earth, I'm going to make it a covenantal term, covenantal. So he's saying, until I've come not to abolish the Torah, but to fulfill it, the covenant will pass away before my words pass away. See, it doesn't make any sense. Literally, it literally doesn't make any sense. But we have to keep that phrase, I think, in place. I've come not to abolish it. So no matter what he does, if he abolishes it, he didn't tell the truth right there. And I think he tells the truth because he lines up with Old Testament scriptures, not because he changes them. So I'll throw that out there and get people's thoughts on that, because it always has struck me odd, you know, people abolishing the Torah. And then we see that the plain reference of that, you know, let's get away from this preterism model and start thinking about what actually happened after the crucifixion. You see Peter and James, and you see this in the Clementines all over the place. They stayed to be law keepers. And I think the disconnect people are having is they forget, or they never understood in the first place, that in the Old Testament, you had three classes of people: God-fearers, proselytes, and converts. Proselytes necessarily weren't always converts, but let's say you had those three basic categories. They were already in place. In the Old Testament, even before any kind of Messiah, remember, Messiah was something that was taught in Midrash. And, you know, I've heard a lot of people coming out against the oral law. Well, Jesus uses the oral law as a defense for eating when he's given the thing about the showbread in David. There's nowhere in Torah that lets you break any law. Not to my knowledge. It comes from the Midrash. And it's that if you're in danger, you have the right to break Torah to preserve life. And that's the teaching he's appealing to. So, and remember this, without the Torah, the oral law, as we call it, okay, we would have not got the Masoretic text. It's the vowel pointings were handed down orally. So in other words, you would read a scroll early. This is early Judaism. You read a scroll, is basically nothing but consonants. Okay? So you didn't know what the vowels were. You had to memorize that. You had to know how to read those words. Like Mary Magdalene. You know, you remove the vowels, it's Migdal or Migdil. And it means the tower, basically, is what it appears to be. So without this oral transmission, you never would have got the Masoretic text, which is what your Old Testaments are and that's what Masoretic means, I think. It means received. This is what they received from people. So the oral tradition, they wrote down and started putting vowel markings on the text. Well, that was the oral tradition turned into writing. So Jesus would have fully understood these oral teachings if he was able to read the scrolls. If you could read Torah, it was because you understood that how to pronounce the words, and that was given by memory. But so I'm gonna just throw those things out there. You know, you see that James is teaching Jews to stay Jews. And then he gives a set of commandments which are suspiciously like the Noahide commandments that came from Midrashic teachings as well. You know, these are the things you should be doing and be doing well. Now the argument becomes, well, when they started doing these things and they started attending synagogue, were they expected to become full-fledged Jews? You got to remember, Christianity was a sect of Judaism. And they were called followers of the way. They weren't even called Christians. And that's why even some of the stuff with Nero becomes questionable. If the knowledge of Christians really would have been that great to begin with, they would have been almost indistinguishable from Judaism. And it would appear that outside of Paul, they were mainly concerned with getting people back to Torah life. And that's, I don't think anyone would argue that's what Jesus taught, was getting back to Torah. I mean, even Jews today, I mean, there's a real good book about this, is the Kosher Jesus by Shmiley Botiek, whatever he pronounces his name. He's a rabbi, and he points out all these oral traditions that Jesus uses throughout his teachings. So maybe Jesus's problem wasn't so much with the fact they had an oral tradition, is that the oral tradition, just like their use of the Torah, was used to hurt people. at the end of the day, it was used unjustly. Okay, and I'm not saying Jesus, taught the oral law. I'm not saying that either. But what I'm saying is he definitely, I don't think, had a problem with it existing in of itself. And I think when Western Christians and Protestants talk about it, they don't realize that without the oral law, you would not have an Old Testament you could even read. Okay, that's what we need to remember. And he uses it as a defense. Jesus appeals to the Midrash as a defense. So that those are very true statements. But I do want to throw that out there and get some thoughts on that, on not abolishing the law. So how could it, now that he said that, how could anything he does after that abolish the law? And completing that, I don't find the sense in Torah when you read the Old Testament, and maybe some people can point the scriptures out if that's the case. I don't find any scriptures talking about the Torah being completed. And it's like, okay, we put everything into the Torah box. We're going to close it now. And whew, I don't find that anywhere in Torah. And I think what he's saying by fulfilling or completing, that's what I think he's getting at, is that I'm going to keep it perfectly. That has absolutely nothing to do with what happens to it after he's completed all of the commandments of his Father perfectly. And then he makes this statement before. No one finds this odd, that he just point blank tells you, I'm not here to abolish it. So what would we say? Now if I came to you saying Jesus abolished the Torah, and you read that verse and you say, well, Jesus himself said he didn't come to abolish it, you would say I was saying something different than Jesus. There always was a salvation system in place for Gentiles. There actually was in Judaism. It was there. You could be a God-fearer and have a place in the world to come. So that teaching existed long before any of the apostles of Jesus was even born. So, and I think Paul's thing, what it seems to me is that he was actually pushing to make what was called a God-fearer at the time a equal to a Jew. And I think that did lead to beef with people. And I'm not, like bringing the uncircumcised into the temple. That's why he gets hemmed up. So, I'm not going to go into that here, but that seems to me being kind of what happened. That seemed to be the beef that was going on. And, that's why he fell out with Barnabas. He fell out with Peter for the same thing, table fellowship with Gentiles. Him and Barnabas got into it so bad, Barnabas refused to travel with him. I mean, that's how serious this stuff got between them. And James and Peter both address the Jews in Dispersia and tell them to keep to the Torah. They tell them to keep to the word. So, and that's why it's important. Once you've done away with corporate Israel, if you want to use that term, and you create spiritual Israel, you can't allow these distinctions to exist anymore. Now we get into the static model where you make everyone say the same thing. But it's not what you see in the early church. And these contrivances of, well, so-and-so had a right to break the Torah, and so-and-so had a right to do this and that before 70 AD, before the covenant was ratified. Well, there's no scriptural evidence for that. It's pure eisegesis. It's what someone extrapolates from what they perceive to be true. But it's not a scriptural argument for that. There isn't. There isn't a scriptural argument that gives anyone an excuse to break Torah. And what does Jesus himself say? If you teach people not to do the Torah, you'll be the least in the kingdom of heaven. It's kind of a weird thing to say, huh? So you have people running around saying, I don't think they were saying that. I don't think they were saying that at all. I think there's a place for the Torah. There's a place where it belongs. It's teachings of, it's obedience. It's an obedience thing. It's not a salvation thing. And people, they mash it up and they get it all twisted up and they say, well, if you keep Torah, then you're throwing away your salvation because you don't believe in Jesus. Well, I think there's a stronger argument to be made that if you start following Torah to the best of your ability, it's out of obedience to Jesus. So, Jesus kept Torah. It's kind of a funny thing. But again, throw that out there. If he said he didn't come to abolish it, if he said it out of his own mouth, I've come not to abolish it, but to complete it. And like I said, there are no passages in the Old Testament that I'm aware of where it talks about this being fulfilled. Now, that covenant where they put the law on the inward parts, even that's not throwing out the Torah. What it's saying is that he's putting the Torah in your heart. So you kind of catching yourself in a catch-22, in my opinion. He puts the Torah in your heart. So keeping the Torah should be easy for you at that point. You see what I'm saying? But there is a distinction between Gentiles and Jews. Even in the New Testament, and it's in the Old Testament, it's run through the whole book. But both of those people could be accepted. And I think what we're doing is kind of gumming up the works. And I think with a doctrine like preterism, you can't even acknowledge these facts in Scripture. You literally have to say, well, the fact James and Peter held to Torah, they were just wrong ultimately. And Paul was right, and he did away with Torah. I think you have to make a lot of extrapolations there that don't seem to line up with Jesus's own teaching. I don't think they line up at all. But I think when you let each book speak and each person speak, and it lays out this picture of what they were working out in the early church, and you get this image with these people that, like, someone like Paul just got everything downloaded in his brain, and he just knew it all. And that's not, Paul struggled through these issues like everyone else. He was very human, and I think people are so quick to make people unhuman. Even Jesus, the way you listen to how they talk about Jesus, it's like he just knew everything. He wasn't. They dehumanize him very quickly, and I'm still watching people. They still talking about this. They'll say, well, they'll talk about John and the theological gospel of John, and then they go on to say what they're going to say about it, and all of it literally happened again. Nicodemus had this conversation. So it's a distinction without difference. It really is. It makes me question, even if you want to take it at wisdom literature, no one's teaching it like wisdom literature. All they're doing is reading it for what exactly it says and repeating it and saying, here it is. John's gospel says A, B, and C. There's no spiritual interpretation of that. They just literally are reading it. So we're back again to this verbatim, literal, historical understanding. If that's a mystic gospel, there should be all kinds of profound crap coming out of it, and there's not. You're just reading it for what it says. The Logos became flesh. Nicodemus had to be born again. What does it mean to be born? You're just reading the text verbatim. There's nothing spiritual about it. So, I'm going to stop. But people really need to think about these things. Let these books speak individually for themselves and quit creating things that aren't there. But I do want to throw that out there, what people think about Jesus saying, I've come not to abolish the Torah, the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish them. So what I would say is basically, if you came up to me and said, hey, I have not come to abolish your house, but to complete your house, to fill out all of its good works, and then 2 years later, you knock down my house, I would say you came to abolish my house. So that's an interesting dichotomy that I think modern Christianity has been up pretty bad. So throw that out there. God bless.